Your place is in the dirt. You are a disgrace. My father's hand struck my face before I even saw the movement. The impact cracked like a whip across the silent dining room, followed immediately by the sharp clatter of silver forks dropping onto fine bone china. A warm, metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth. I stood completely frozen, feeling the burning heat spread across my cheek, suffocated by the heavy scent of fresh pine needles and melting beeswax candles. I am Avery Monroe, 35 years old, and a trauma surgeon at one of the busiest hospitals in Manhattan. I spend my life putting broken bodies back together, yet here I was, being physically assaulted by my own father in front of 80 wealthy donors. "Get her out of here," my mother, Evelyn, ordered. She waved a manicured hand toward the private security guard standing by the double oak doors. "Take her out the back." Before the guards could take a single step, Governor James Whitaker pushed his chair back and stood up. He grabbed his crystal water glass, raising it high, and brought it down hard on the edge of the long table. The glass shattered, sending glittering shards raining onto the white linen cloth. "Back away from her," the governor thundered, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Do you realize you just struck the elite surgeon who saved my wife's life?" Nobody moved. My father's face drained of color, his hands hovering over a printed affidavit resting on the table between us. I stared down at the document, watching the wet ink of his fresh signature catch the light of the chandelier. He wanted my signature right next to his. He had brought me here to spring a trap. 6 hours earlier, the idea of a trap was the furthest thing from my mind. I was standing at a steel sink in the hospital locker room, scrubbing the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift off my skin, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's name. We had barely spoken in 7 years, not since the night my younger sister, Lily, died. I answered the call, fully expecting a demand for medical advice for a distant relative, but her voice was surprisingly soft. She told me the family was hosting a small Christmas dinner, and she wanted me there. "Lily would not want us to live like this," my mother murmured, her tone dripping with practiced sorrow. "It might be the last Christmas we all have a chance to sit at the same table." She used my sister's memory like a master key, turning it perfectly to unlock the one door I could never completely bolt shut. I wanted to believe her, so I agreed to drive upstate. 10 minutes later, as I was buttoning my winter coat, my phone buzzed with a new text message. It came from an unknown number and contained exactly 2 sentences. "Do not sign anything tonight. The original record still exists." I stared at the glowing screen, my pulse instantly picking up rhythm. I tried to call the number back, but an automated voice informed me the line was out of service. I took a quick screenshot of the cryptic warning, forwarded it to my attorney, Rachel Cohen, and walked out into the freezing city air. The Monroe estate in Westchester County was blazing with light when I handed my keys to the valet. Walking through the massive front doors, I immediately realized my mother had lied. This was not an intimate family reconciliation. The grand foyer hummed with the quiet conversations of corporate executives, politicians, and hospital administrators. It was the annual Monroe Foundation donor dinner. Governor Whitaker and his wife Laura were standing near the sweeping staircase. Laura spotted me, excused herself from a group of investors, and pulled me into a warm, genuine hug. I had operated on her after a severe highway pileup a year ago, and she never forgot it. Over her shoulder, I caught my father watching us. Thomas Monroe loathed the fact that the daughter he considered a failure was standing in his home receiving gratitude from the most powerful woman in the room. I moved away from the crowd, seeking a quiet corner, and found myself standing next to the towering Christmas tree. Nestled between the expensive glass baubles was a tarnished silver snowflake ornament, Lily's ornament. The sudden, phantom scent of the gardenia perfume she always wore seemed to float in the air, wrapping around my chest. I reached out and gently traced the chipped metal edge of the snowflake, remembering the day she dropped it on the kitchen tile. A hand clamped down hard on my wrist, forcefully pulling my fingers away from the branch. "Do not break anything else of your sister's," my mother hissed, materializing beside me. Her eyes were flat and cold, completely devoid of the warmth she had projected over the phone. We took our seats in the formal dining room a few minutes later. I sat near the center of the long table, unfolding my stiff linen napkin, and felt the heavy weight of a thick envelope hidden underneath the fabric. I slid the envelope onto my lap and broke the seal. Inside was a legal document titled Historical Clinical Clarification and Release. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, catching the critical phrases buried in the legal jargon. The document officially declared that I had made the sole decision not to transfer Lily to a hospital on the night she died, and it fully released Monroe Aesthetic Center from any liability. My father leaned in close, his shoulder brushing mine. Dropping his voice to a whisper meant only for me. "Sign it before they serve dessert," he instructed, his tone smooth and deadly. "Sign it, and this family can finally start over." I looked up from the paper and noticed the small red lights blinking on the digital cameras positioned in the corners of the room. The foundation always recorded these dinners for promotional materials, and my parents had placed me directly in the center frame. They did not just want my signature on a piece of paper. They wanted a public confession. "Sign it," my father whispered again, his fingers digging into my arm under the table. "Or, I will tell every person in this room how you killed your sister." My father leaned back in his chair, adjusting his silk tie as if he had not just threatened to destroy my life. He reached for his crystal goblet, tapped a silver spoon against the rim, and waited for the room to quiet down. Thomas cleared his throat, projecting his voice so the microphones near the floral centerpieces could pick up every word. He spoke of a tragedy that had haunted our family for 7 long years. He painted a picture of endless grief, carefully avoiding my name at first. The narrative was meticulously crafted, portraying him and my mother as gracious victims who had finally found it in their hearts to forgive the daughter who brought them so much pain. Around the table, wealthy investors nodded with profound sympathy, fully believing they were witnessing a beautiful holiday reconciliation. I knew better. Every word leaving my father's mouth was laying the groundwork for my public confession. A soft click drew my attention back to the table. Evelyn placed a heavy silver fountain pen next to the printed affidavit. I recognized the intricate engraving immediately, and a tight knot formed in my throat. It belonged to Lily. The woman who raised me leaned in close, offering a smile that did not reach her eyes. She whispered that if I truly loved my sister, I would sign the paper and end this suffering, promising that I could finally come home. I stared at the silver pen, then looked up at the blinking red lights of the cameras. I asked my mother, keeping my voice loud enough for the adjacent guests to hear, why Northbridge Health required a signed confession right before the dessert course. The absolute silence that fell over the dining room told me I had guessed exactly right. The corporate buyout was stalling, and my signature was the only thing that could save it. I pushed my chair back and stood up straight. The heavy wood scraped loudly against the marble floor. I announced to the entire room that I would not sign any legal document without my attorney present. Across the table, Brandon let out a loud, mocking laugh. My older brother leaned forward, resting his elbows on the linen cloth, and called me a coward who always used technicalities to hide from the truth. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked directly into his eyes and asked why the equipment logs from the night Lily died were conveniently missing from the official medical record. For a fraction of a second, Brandon lost his arrogant smirk. His posture stiffened, and a visible flash of panic widened his eyes. He quickly masked it by taking a sip of wine, but the hesitation was all the confirmation I needed. He knew exactly what those logs contained. Thomas realized he was losing control of the narrative. He abandoned his gentle, forgiving persona and raised his voice for the entire room to hear. My father pointed a trembling finger at me, declaring that I had abandoned my own sister to bleed out just to save my prestigious surgical residency. Right on cue, Evelyn buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with perfectly timed sobs while the cameras recorded her performance. Murmurs of disgust rippled through the crowd of elite guests. People I had known since childhood were glaring at me with unfiltered contempt. A few seats away, Laura Whitaker gripped the edge of the table and prepared to stand up in my defense. I caught her eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of my head. I needed my family to play all their cards, and I wanted them to speak every lie they had rehearsed. I looked down at the paper, then back at my father, and stated clearly that his document was nothing but a fabricated confession designed to push through a fraudulent corporate sale. The truth of the statement shattered his control, and his hand cracked across my face with blinding speed. The stinging impact sent my head snapping to the side, and the room gasped in collective shock. Evelyn immediately ordered the private security guards to drag me out of the house. That was when Governor Whitaker shattered his glass against the table. He stepped out of his chair, placing his tall frame directly between me and the advancing guards. The governor did not invoke his political office to threaten anyone with arrest, nor did he try to solve the mystery of my sister's death. He simply demanded that the security team back away. His voice commanded absolute authority as he stated he did not know the history of this family, but he knew he had just watched a man brutally assault his own daughter to force a signature. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone in the shocked crowd had already called the local police. I knew demanding my father's immediate arrest would only result in a messy, chaotic scene that they could easily spin to the press. I needed to maintain total clinical precision. I pulled out my phone, snapped a quick photograph of the red, swelling mark on my face, and then picked up the unsigned affidavit. My fingers closed around Lily's silver pen. A hand clamped onto my wrist. Evelyn glared at me, her tears completely gone, and hissed that the pen belonged to this family. I pulled my arm free with a sharp tug. I looked at the woman who had just tried to sell me out for a corporate merger, and I told her Lily was my family too. I walked out the front doors on my own 2 feet, leaving the stunned guests and the arriving police officers behind. The cold winter air felt sharp against my burning cheek as I climbed into the driver's seat of my car. I locked the doors and started the engine, letting the heater chase away the chill. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was another text message from the unknown number. They know the audit trail survived. Someone just tried to delete it. Less than 10 seconds later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Rachel Cohen. I accepted the call and heard my attorney's voice, tense and urgent. Rachel instructed me not to go home tonight. She explained that whoever sent that anonymous message knows exactly where the original chart is located, and my father knows it too. The glass doors of Cohen and Associates slid open, offering a quiet sanctuary from the chaos of the night. Rachel had ushered me directly into a secure conference room instead of letting me drive back to my empty apartment. A man stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminated by the city lights. Jordan Blake, the man Lily had planned to marry. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my collarbone, realizing the unknown sender finally had a face. I demanded to know why he was texting me in riddles instead of turning the evidence over to the authorities. Jordan held up his hands in a gesture of peace. The compliance manager explained that he had placed a legal hold on the Monroe medical database the moment he noticed the discrepancies. He firmly refused to show me the raw files directly, insisting that breaking the strict chain of custody would give my father the exact legal loophole needed to throw the evidence out of court. We had to do this by the book. Looking at Jordan brought the past rushing back. 7 years vanished in a single breath, and the heavy scent of sterile iodine mixed with lavender room spray flooded my memory. I was instantly transported back to a pristine recovery room at the Monroe Aesthetic Center. My phone had rung at 8:12 that evening. Lily sounded breathless, her voice trembling over the line. When I pushed through the clinic doors at 8:19, the clinical signs screamed at me before anyone even spoke a word. My younger sister lay on a surgical cot, her skin holding the pale, translucent quality of wax. I pressed my fingers to her wrist and found cold sweat covering a thread like racing pulse. Her abdomen felt rigid under my hands. A massive internal hemorrhage was actively stealing her life. Every second counted. I grabbed the wall phone, dialed the regional transfer center at exactly 8:23, and rapidly ordered an advanced life support ambulance, along with an emergency trauma operating room. A heavy hand slammed down on the receiver, instantly severing the connection. Thomas Monroe stood over me, his face twisted in anger. The medical director of the facility pulled out his own cell phone, informed the dispatcher that the previous caller had no clinical privileges in his building, and smoothly dismissed the critical emergency as a minor reaction to routine sedatives. My older brother stood trembling near the sterile surgical tray. Brandon admitted, his voice cracking with panic, that the suction cannula might have gone too deep during the unauthorized procedure. He begged our father not to call the paramedics, completely terrified of losing his medical license. Evelyn stepped to the side of the cot, smoothing Lily's damp hair while murmuring that a public hospital transfer would create a massive media scandal. My mother prioritized the family name and the upcoming corporate sale over the life bleeding out in front of her. Lily turned her head, her tired eyes finding mine, and asked me if a hospital was really necessary. I told her yes. That was the last time my sister looked at me with absolute trust. Thomas did not hesitate to eliminate the threat I posed. The medical director summoned the private building security, ordering my immediate removal from the clinical floor. I argued fiercely, shouting for any of the nursing staff to pick up a phone, but the guards forced me through the heavy glass doors. My security badge registered the forced exit at exactly 8:26, The biting winter wind whipped across my face as I stood in the parking lot. I pulled out my cell phone, dialed 911 at 8:28, and gave the dispatcher the exact address. I clearly reported a young female patient suffering from acute hemorrhagic shock being detained inside a private facility, demanding an immediate police and medical response. 4 minutes later, the emergency dispatcher informed me that the clinic director had called back on the official business line to report a false alarm. I refused to back down, insisting on a police welfare check. When the flashing blue lights of a patrol cruiser finally arrived, Thomas met the officers at the main entrance. My father presented a fabricated temporary clinical note stating the patient was fully conscious, completely stable, and refusing outside treatment. He then pointed a finger directly at me, threatening to press trespassing charges if I did not vacate the premises immediately. Lacking physical proof of immediate danger and facing a licensed medical director, the officers told me I had to leave the property. I drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, completely powerless to breach the walls of my own family's clinic. Diane Mercer, a terrified clinic nurse, finally called an ambulance at 10:18 that night, but the delay proved fatal. The hospital pronounced Lily dead just before midnight, and since the sudden death of a 26-year-old woman required an automatic autopsy, the medical examiner took jurisdiction. The forensic pathologist easily found the fatal internal lacerations and massive blood loss. My family could not hide the physical cause of death, so they meticulously manipulated the paperwork instead. Thomas submitted a forged operative report and an altered patient chart to the investigators. The fake documents listed my father as the supervising surgeon, reduced Brandon to a mere surgical assistant, and falsely claimed I had taken over the post-operative care. The falsified record stated I had evaluated my sister as stable and personally refused the hospital transfer. To completely seal the lie, Thomas called the hospital investigators the next morning, claiming I had administered the wrong medications and panicked. Sitting in the sterile conference room in the present day, the crushing weight of that injustice settled heavily on my shoulders. Jordan kept the raw medical files turned away from me. He explained that the records submitted 7 years ago did not match the audit history preserved by the medical software vendor. He had already placed the relevant data under a formal legal hold and reported the discrepancy to the vendor's legal department. Showing me the raw chart or copying it onto another device could damage the chain of custody, so he refused to let any of us handle the original files. Instead, Jordan handed Rachel a compliance incident notice containing only the information he was authorized to disclose. One preserved audit event identified the administrator account used to attach my electronic signature to the false transfer refusal. Rachel read the registered account holder's name aloud. Avery Monroe. I did not need to see the raw code to understand what it meant. The woman who had wept the loudest beside Lily's casket was connected to the account used to frame me for her death. Morning light hit the conference room window, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. Christmas morning had arrived wrapped in damage control. My phone buzzed against the glass, drawing Rachel's immediate attention. The attorney picked up the device, her expression tightening before she turned the screen toward me. The local news site had already published an exclusive statement from the Monroe Foundation. My father had not wasted a single minute. The bold headline screamed about a malicious extortion attempt orchestrated by a disgruntled former employee and an unstable, estranged family member. Thomas claimed I was being manipulated by an obsessed ex-fiancé who never moved on from Lily's tragic medical complication. A short, heavily edited video clip accompanied the digital article. The footage showed me standing at the dinner table, looking furious and combative, completely omitting the moment Thomas violently struck my face. The media narrative was crystal clear. Jordan and I were the greedy villains, and the Monroe family were the grieving, victimized philanthropists. Rachel locked my phone screen and turned her sharp gaze on the man sitting across from us. She demanded to know exactly how he had accessed the clinic's servers and what his corporate authorization level entailed. Jordan did not flinch under the attorney's intense cross-examination. The compliance manager smoothly produced a digital work order, internal reporting emails, and the precise timestamp of his legal hold request. His access was entirely legitimate, strictly tied to the corporate acquisition audit. He had not downloaded a single patient file to his personal devices. The lingering suspicion that he was running a rogue hacking operation dissolved instantly. Jordan was just a professional doing his job by the book, and his clean paper trail meant Thomas could not easily throw the data out of court. Rachel immediately sent formal preservation notices to the Regional Transfer Center, the County Emergency Communications Office, and the local police department. The notices required each agency to retain every recording, telephone log, dispatch entry, and welfare check report connected to the night Lily died. Preserving the records did not automatically give us access to them. The files remained sealed until the state investigator assigned to the case served the necessary subpoenas. 2 days later, Rachel and I sat in her office while the lawfully produced recordings played through the speakers. The first file carried a timestamp of 8:23. My own voice requested a trauma bay and an advanced life support ambulance. The second recording began at 8:28. I heard myself standing in the freezing parking lot, reporting a young female patient in acute hemorrhagic shock and demanding an immediate police and medical response. Then the third file played. At 8:32, Thomas Monroe called from the clinic's official business line. My father told the emergency dispatcher that a distressed family member had triggered a false alarm and that the patient was stable under his supervision. The subpoenaed police report documented my protests at the property line and Thomas threatening to press trespassing charges if I entered the building again. The 3 independent records established one fact beyond dispute. I had not abandoned Lily. I had called for help twice and had been deliberately locked out. Another piece of the past surfaced just before sunset. My phone vibrated with an unknown number, and a hesitant, trembling voice spoke my name. Diane Mercer. The former clinic nurse had seen the morning news and could no longer stomach the suffocating guilt. Diane admitted she had been terrified of losing her pension 7 years ago, but the sight of my father's public lies finally broke her silence. The frightened woman promised to hand over her personal shift log to Rachel. She had written down a single damning sentence that night. Avery requested transfer. Dr. Monroe canceled. Her spiral notebook alone could not guarantee a criminal conviction, but combined with the audio logs, the walls around my father began to crumble. Jordan reached into his leather briefcase and placed an old, deactivated cell phone on the table. He powered the device on, bypassing the lock screen, and opened a saved text message thread. The compliance manager explained that he had kept Lily's final messages preserved on the hard drive for 7 years. I stared at the glowing screen, reading words typed by fingers that were now buried in the earth. Lily had written that Avery says I need a hospital, Dad says it will destroy Brandon and the sale, and Mom says I am panicking. The sheer weight of her last coherent thought pressed down heavily on my chest. I did not reach out to hold Jordan's hand, nor did he offer his shoulder for comfort. We were 2 people bound by a shared, devastating loss, maintaining a necessary professional distance while building a cage for the people who took her from us. The text message was heartbreaking, but Jordan revealed something far more dangerous. He pulled up the clinic's administrative export log, pointing to a massive data transfer that occurred in the early hours of the morning following Lily's death. Evelyn Monroe had not just forged my electronic signature on a fake refusal note. The system showed she had deliberately copied a complete, unedited version of the original audit trail and exported it to a private external drive. My mother had not deleted the evidence. She had carefully archived it. Evelyn kept the truth hidden as a personal insurance policy against her own husband. My phone lit up on the table, vibrating loudly against the polished wood. The caller ID displayed my mother's cell number. I drew a slow breath, answered the call, and placed the device on speakerphone. Evelyn did not offer a traditional holiday greeting. Her voice drifted through the speaker, devoid of any maternal warmth, sounding exactly like a ruthless executive negotiating a hostile corporate takeover. She told me she had what I needed to destroy my father. A brief, calculated pause stretched over the line before she delivered her final condition. But if you want it, you will protect me first. Stained glass windows filtered the pale afternoon light into the small chapel where my family had held a memorial service 7 years ago. The cold air inside the sanctuary smelled heavily of polished oak and melting wax. My mother sat alone in the front pew, wearing a dark wool coat, looking small and fragile against the massive wooden altar. It was a perfectly staged performance designed to evoke pity. Rachel walked down the aisle beside me, her footsteps clicking sharply against the stone floor. Evelyn turned around, and the fragile illusion vanished instantly. Her jaw tightened at the sight of my attorney. She had clearly expected to manipulate her daughter in private, completely isolated from any legal counsel. "This is a family matter," my mother whispered, her voice echoing in the empty church. Rachel set her leather briefcase on the wooden bench and stated clearly that all communications regarding the medical record would go through her office. Evelyn let out a long, dramatic sigh, flawlessly shifting into the role of the exhausted victim. The woman who raised me opened her designer purse, pulled out a silver smartphone, and placed it carefully on the hymnal rack. She claimed my father had forced her to use the administrative clinic account, weeping softly about his violent temper and her desperate need to keep Brandon from committing suicide. Evelyn tapped the screen, playing a short audio file. The unmistakable, commanding voice of Thomas Monroe filled the quiet space. He stated clearly that if Avery took the blame, the corporate sale would survive. The recording abruptly cut to silence. Evelyn wiped a single tear from her cheek, promising to hand over the original digital drive to us. She only asked for a simple statement in return, a legally binding document declaring she had acted entirely under severe emotional duress. Signing that paper would allow her to keep the massive Westchester estate and her personal investment portfolios completely untouched by the looming lawsuit. In exchange, she promised to hold a press conference and publicly proclaim my absolute innocence. That was the exact promise I had starved for over the past 7 years. Hearing it now, standing in the very room where we had buried my sister, brought only a freezing wave of clarity. I looked down at the woman holding the phone and asked a single question. I wanted to know why she let them destroy my surgical career instead of using this recording to save me. Evelyn blinked, genuinely confused by my lack of immediate gratitude. She answered that the whole family would have lost everything. The truth crystallized in the cold air between us. In her pristine, carefully managed world, I was never actually part of that family. I told my mother she could submit her evidence through the proper legal channels, turned my back on her bewildered expression, and walked out of the chapel. Back in the secure conference room at Cohen & Associates, a digital forensics consultant examined the audio file Evelyn had voluntarily provided. The file contained clear signs of recent editing. Its duration, encoding history, and abrupt ending indicated that it had been cut from a longer recording. Rachel sent an immediate preservation demand to Evelyn's attorney and notified the state investigator that the original recording might be stored in a private cloud account. No one on our team attempted to enter that account. The investigator obtained a court order requiring the cloud provider to preserve the account. After presenting the edited recording and Evelyn's attempt to trade evidence for protection, the prosecutor secured lawful access to the stored files. Several days later, the forensic copy of the original recording was produced. Rachel pressed play. My father's voice filled the room. If Avery takes the blame, Brandon keeps his license and the sale survives. A long silence followed. Then my mother answered. Then make sure the chart says Avery refused the transfer. I can add her signature. There was no fear in Evelyn's voice, no hesitation, no sign that Thomas had forced the idea upon her. My mother had not merely obeyed the cover-up, she had helped design it. I looked down at the gold medical school graduation ring my parents had given me. I slid it from my finger and placed it quietly on the table. I was done asking for a seat at their table. Before anyone could speak, a sharp chime interrupted the silence. Rachel picked up her phone and read an urgent notice from the state court clerk. Thomas had filed an emergency motion for a protective order. His attorneys accused Jordan of exceeding his corporate authority and asked the court to block further disclosure of the audit data until Jordan's access could be reviewed. The hearing took place the following morning. Thomas's attorney portrayed Jordan as an obsessed former fiancé who had used a corporate assignment to search for personal revenge. He asked the judge to quash the pending subpoenas and prevent investigators from relying on any files Jordan had identified. Rachel responded with Jordan's formal project assignment, his internal compliance reports, the legal hold timestamps, and the vendor's complete access logs. The records showed that Jordan had reviewed only the data assigned to him, had copied nothing onto a personal device, and had immediately reported the discrepancy through the proper channels. The judge denied Thomas's request to block the subpoenas. She ordered the vendor to continue preserving the original data and directed that any future production occur under a protective order. Thomas had failed to bury the audit trail, but the ruling did not decide the larger criminal case. It simply ensured the original evidence would survive long enough to be examined properly. We barely returned to the law firm before Rachel's office phone rang. The screen displayed the name of an independent defense attorney representing Brandon Monroe. My older brother was terrified, and he was requesting an immediate proffer session. His lawyer explained that Thomas was actively drafting a public statement, preparing to claim Brandon had gone rogue, performed the unauthorized procedure entirely alone, and unilaterally decided to keep Lily at the clinic. The golden sun was being served up on a silver platter. Brandon offered to hand over a cache of private emails if I agreed to support a leniency deal with the medical board. I sat across from Rachel, staring at the speakerphone, and explicitly stated I would promise absolutely nothing until I saw the evidence. An encrypted file transfer arrived in Rachel's inbox 30 minutes later, painting a damning picture of a father protecting his empire at any cost. A pre-procedure email from Thomas explicitly authorized the late-night operation, fully acknowledging Brandon lacked the proper clinical privileges. My father wrote that Lily was family and they needed her looking perfect for the upcoming promotional gala. Another message, time-stamped right after security dragged me out of the building, ordered his son to cancel any emergency transport. No ambulance unless I approve it, the text read. We cannot have regulators here tonight. Attached telecom logs perfectly matched the clinic records, proving Thomas personally dialed the dispatcher right after my 911 call to report a fabricated false alarm. The actual proffer session took place in a neutral, windowless arbitration room later that afternoon. Brandon sat across the table, his designer suit looking wrinkled and oversized on his slumping frame. Sweat gathered at his hairline. He refused to meet my eyes, stammering that he honestly believed Lily was just having a bad reaction to the anesthesia. He claimed Thomas was the experienced medical director and knew better. I kept my voice perfectly level, asking my brother why he deliberately turned off the vital sign monitors if he thought the patient was perfectly stable. His hands trembled as he gripped a paper water cup. Brandon claimed the loud beeping noise was making Lily panic, so he silenced the machine to keep her calm. The excuse reeked of desperate selfishness, but a silenced alarm alone did not completely prove he knew she was actively bleeding to death. Jordan slid a thick stack of printed server logs across the table, obliterating my brother's weak defense. The raw data showed the surgical vacuum machine had been unlocked using Brandon's specific credentials. Supply barcodes for the cannula and sterile drapes were scanned directly under his name. Multiple critical blood pressure alerts had been manually overridden using his secure passcode. The electronic medication cabinet recorded that he withdrew 2 additional doses of heavy sedatives long after I had been forced off the property. Rachel then produced a recovered text message sent from Brandon to Thomas. Her pressure keeps dropping, the message read. Avery may be right. My father's response arrived 1 minute later, instructing his son to keep her stable until the donor event ended. The medical examiner had accurately documented the internal perforation and fatal hemorrhage 7 years ago. What the forensic pathologist could not independently determine was which physician had performed each clinical action before Lily reached the hospital. The operative report submitted by my family identified Thomas as the supervising surgeon, described Brandon as an assistant, and falsely placed me in charge of the post-operative decisions. The newly recovered machine credentials, supply scans, medication records, and building access logs strongly contradicted that version. Together, they showed that Brandon had controlled the surgical equipment while Thomas was absent from the procedure room, and that I had been removed from the building before the false notes were created. The records did not stand alone, but when combined with Brandon's messages, his later admission, and the altered operative report, they established that he had performed the unauthorized procedure and concealed the resulting emergency. Confronted with the digital trail, my brother finally broke. The favored child buried his face in his hands, weeping openly in front of the opposing attorneys. He confessed that he knew Lily desperately needed a trauma center, but he was paralyzed by the fear of losing his medical license and being cut out of the lucrative family business. Brandon sobbed, claiming he believed our father could fix everything. I looked at the man sitting across from me, realizing he had never intended to murder our sister. He had simply chosen his own comfort over her survival, moment by moment, until it was too late. He wiped his face with a shaking hand and looked up at me. His next words confirmed just how deep the betrayal ran. Dad did not stop with the ambulance, Brandon whispered, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He told Mom to write a completely new operative report before the body even went to the morgue. He sent the hospital and the medical examiner a chart that made you the doctor in charge. The medical board hearing room smelled of stale coffee and lemon floor polish. Northbridge Health had already suspended its acquisition of Monroe Medical Holdings. In a separate court proceeding, A state judge had issued a temporary order preventing the company from transferring disputed assets or destroying corporate records. The medical board had convened an emergency hearing for a narrower purpose, to determine whether Thomas and Brandon posed an immediate danger to patients and whether their medical licenses should be suspended while the investigation continued. We sat at a long laminate table, facing a panel of 3 medical commissioners. Thomas Monroe sat on the opposite side of the room, whispering furiously to his lead attorney. My father wore a sharp charcoal suit, projecting absolute confidence, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. The defense attorney stood up, straightening his tie, and immediately launched a calculated attack on my credibility. The man paced in front of the commissioner panel, questioning how any human being could possibly remember exact minutes from a chaotic night 7 years ago. He suggested, his voice dripping with condescension, that I had simply reconstructed a convenient timeline after reviewing the medical files. I kept my hands folded on the table and waited for him to finish. Rachel nodded slightly, signaling my turn to speak. I looked directly at the center commissioner. I explained that trauma surgeons do not measure time in hours. We measure life in minutes and seconds, because a 3-minute delay in stopping a hemorrhage means the difference between a pulse and a corpse. My father used to mock my obsession with counting seconds during my residency, but my patients survive because I never stop watching the clock. Rachel stood and activated the projector, displaying a blank white screen. She promised to populate it with undisputed digital timestamps, pulling from emergency dispatch logs, building security servers, and telecom records. The first number appeared, 823. I called the Regional Transfer Center, requesting a trauma bay. 3 minutes later, 826 illuminated the board. My security badge swiped at the main clinic exit, definitively proving security guards had forced me out of the building. The next timestamp hit the screen. 828. I dialed 911 from the parking lot, and my recorded voice requested immediate police and medical intervention for an active internal hemorrhage. Rachel clicked to the next slide, showing clinic phone records. At 8:30, Thomas canceled the internal transfer request. 2 minutes after that, at 8:32, my father called the emergency dispatcher to report a false alarm. The official police welfare check report from that exact window documented my desperate protests at the property line and my father refusing me re-entry. The final set of numbers appeared. At 9:04, Brandon's login credentials muted the surgical vacuum alarms. At 9:12, the clinical note bearing my electronic signature was created in the system, stating I had evaluated Lily and officially refused hospital transport. I leaned forward, making sure my voice carried clearly across the quiet room. I stated that it is physically impossible to stand in a freezing parking lot begging a 911 operator for an ambulance and simultaneously sit inside a clinic signing a medical directive to keep my sister there. The defense attorney stopped pacing. Thomas stared at the projected timeline, the muscles in his jaw clenching tight. The trap they had built for me 7 years ago was entirely dismantled by basic arithmetic. A small, frail woman walked to the witness chair next. Diane Mercer kept her eyes fixed firmly on her lap as she swore to tell the truth. The former clinic nurse admitted, her voice shaking violently, that Thomas had explicitly forbidden the staff from calling an ambulance. Diane turned her head, tears streaming down her face, and offered me a tearful public apology for her silence. I felt no sudden rush of forgiveness. I watched her cry, feeling nothing but cold exhaustion. I told Diane that her truth today would undoubtedly save future patients from a dangerous facility, but her belated courage did not bring Lily back. The nurse flinched, nodding slowly as she absorbed the weight of the consequence. An independent medical expert took the stand an hour later. The gray-haired physician reviewed the original medical examiner report, confirming the physical cause of death remained unchanged. Lily died from massive internal hemorrhage caused by a perforated organ during a liposuction procedure. The expert carefully clarified that forensic pathologists only know what the paperwork tells them regarding clinical decisions. The original investigation relied entirely on the forged operative report my parents had submitted. When Rachel presented the newly recovered machine logs alongside the 911 timeline, the entire medical context shifted. The expert testified that Brandon operating without proper privileges caused the fatal injury, and Thomas actively blocking the emergency medical response significantly reduced the chances of survival. The defense attorney did not bother cross-examining the medical expert. Instead, the man reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp, white sheet of paper. He approached the commissioner panel, declaring he held a signed consent form proving I had formally agreed to take over Lily's post-operative care immediately after arriving at the clinic. He slid a copy across the laminate table toward Rachel and me. I stared at the document. My signature sat on the bottom line, looped and bold. The ink stroke on the capital letter M contained a tiny, distinct break. It was a microscopic flaw caused by a damaged fountain pen I had used exactly once during my residency. I had signed my initial hospital credentialing packet with that broken pen when I was 28 years old. I did not panic, and I did not shout about forgery. I quietly pointed out the broken letter to Rachel, suggesting we request the digital source file for this sudden piece of evidence. The defense attorney looked overly confident, clearly assuming a physical piece of paper would derail our digital momentum. The lead commissioner granted a 30-minute recess to allow our team to review the newly submitted document. We stepped into a private consultation room down the hall. Rachel immediately sent a scanned copy of the consent form to our digital forensics expert, who had been analyzing the clinic servers all morning. We stood in silence, listening to the hum of the air conditioning vent, waiting for the verdict. Rachel's cell phone rang 10 minutes before the recess ended. She answered, putting the forensics expert on speakerphone. The analyst reported that he had located the exact origin of the consent document within the corporate network. The file was not 7 years old. The digital footprint revealed the document had been generated from a scanned image just 3 days before the Christmas donor dinner, and the machine used to create it was a private laptop officially registered to Avery Monroe. Rachel thanked the forensics expert and ended the call. The newly created document did not prove every part of the conspiracy, but it provided strong evidence that someone had continued manufacturing records in the present day. Rachel forwarded the forensic report to the state investigator and the prosecutor assigned to the case. The prosecutor combined it with an affidavit from the document examiner, the preserved audit history, and the evidence of coercion at the Christmas dinner before applying to a judge for a search warrant. The warrant was approved later that day. Investigators seized Evelyn's silver laptop and created a forensic image of its contents. With assistance from the device manufacturer and the account provider, the digital unit gained lawful access without altering the original data. The examination uncovered a carefully organized folder containing a scan of my old credentialing packet. The damaged signature from that packet had been cropped and inserted into the fabricated consent form. Additional folders contained multiple drafts of the Christmas dinner affidavit and a copy of the operative report submitted to the medical examiner after Lily's death. My mother attempted to deflect the blame during her initial police interview. Evelyn wept, claiming my father had ordered her to manufacture the documents under severe threat. The metadata on her hard drive told a completely different story. Version histories proved she had personally retyped several paragraphs to make the legal language sound more convincing. She had also archived copies on an external cloud server, ensuring she held enough leverage to protect her own financial interests. She was not a hostage following orders, but an active architect building a cage. The final piece of the coercion puzzle arrived the following morning. Governor Whitaker's private security detail formally transferred their body camera footage to the district attorney. We gathered around a monitor in the prosecutor's office to watch the unedited video from the holiday dinner. The high-definition recording captured everything the society cameras had missed. Thomas leaning over my shoulder, his fingers digging into my arm as he demanded my signature. Evelyn smoothly signaling the private guards to remove me from the room. Brandon subtly shifting his weight to physically block the main exit doors. The footage did not prove what happened on the night my sister died, but it provided undeniable visual evidence of witness tampering and criminal coercion happening in the present day. The corporate dominoes began falling rapidly by Tuesday afternoon. Northbridge Health formally withdrew their acquisition offer, citing catastrophic due diligence fraud. The massive buyout evaporated in an instant. A state judge subsequently issued an emergency injunction, freezing all financial assets connected to Monroe Medical Holdings. The empire my parents had sacrificed my sister to build was suddenly locked behind a wall of legal tape. Desperation breeds catastrophic mistakes. Despite being served with a strict legal preservation notice, Thomas logged into an outdated administrative portal late Tuesday night. He sent an urgent, high-priority request to the overnight information technology desk, ordering the immediate purge of several server directories he labeled as risky duplicate files. The junior technician on duty did not execute the command. Instead, the young man followed protocol and forwarded the suspicious request directly to the compliance department. Jordan flagged the email and handed it straight to the authorities. The blatant attempt to destroy evidence handed the prosecutor a perfect, airtight obstruction charge. The unified front of the Monroe family completely shattered under the pressure. Evelyn officially filed for legal separation on Thursday morning, desperately attempting to distance her personal investment accounts from the impending criminal fines. Brandon released a written statement through his new defense attorney, publicly declaring that his controlling father had forced his silence for 7 years. Thomas retaliated by calling an impromptu press conference on the steps of the county courthouse. He stood before a cluster of local news microphones, his face flushed with anger, loudly labeling his wife and son as ungrateful traitors. I did not attend the spectacle. I was scrubbing my hands with harsh antibacterial soap in a Manhattan hospital bathroom, having just finished repairing a shattered femur. Watching my family tear each other apart on a small television monitor felt surreal, but returning to my patients kept me anchored to the reality I had built with my own 2 hands. The arrest warrants were executed on Friday morning. Rachel and I stood on the sidewalk across the street from the Monroe Aesthetic Center, accompanied by the lead prosecutor for a final site walkthrough. 2 unmarked police vehicles pulled up to the glass entrance. Uniformed officers escorted Thomas out of the building in handcuffs. High above his head, a maintenance crew was actively unscrewing the heavy brass letters of his name from the facility facade. My father stopped walking when he saw me standing near the prosecutor. The arrogant medical director was gone, replaced by a cornered man willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood. He stared directly into my eyes and loudly declared that Brandon was the only one holding a surgical instrument, shouting that his son was the real killer. The officers guided him into the back of the cruiser, and the doors slammed shut. I watched the vehicle merge into the morning traffic, waiting for a profound sense of closure that never arrived. The prosecutor turned toward me, zipping up his jacket against the cold wind. He spoke in a measured, careful tone, warning me that prosecuting the obstruction and forgery charges would be simple. Proving direct criminal liability for a homicide that occurred 7 years ago, however, presented a massive legal hurdle. I looked away from the empty building, realizing that uncovering the moral truth did not always guarantee a perfect legal reckoning. 6 months later, the stifling August heat baked the asphalt outside the State Medical Board building. The wheels of justice did not turn with the swift, dramatic speed of a television broadcast. Building airtight criminal cases took hundreds of grueling hours, endless depositions, and mountains of subpoenaed paperwork. The prosecutor had meticulously dismantled the Monroe empire brick by brick, securing cooperation agreements and locking down expert testimonies. The first true casualty was Brandon. My older brother sat slumped at the defense table during his final licensing hearing, his tailored suit hanging loosely from a frame that seemed to have shrunk. The medical commissioners reviewed the machine logs, the deleted text messages, and his own sworn proffer statement. Brandon attempted to salvage his career by playing the terrified victim. The favored son wept, claiming a controlling father had ordered his silence, and he begged the panel to understand the immense pressure he faced. The lead commissioner did not offer an ounce of sympathy. The board stated clearly that an oath to do no harm superseded any family loyalty, officially stripping him of his medical license forever. That administrative death sentence paved the way for a swift criminal plea deal, guaranteeing actual prison time and massive financial restitution. Evelyn Monroe tried to negotiate a better fate for herself. The woman who raised me sat in a separate courtroom a week later, offering to testify against her husband in exchange for a drastically reduced sentence. My mother assumed her performance as a battered, coerced wife would save her estate. The prosecutor let her speak, then played the unedited audio recording and presented the document version histories from her silver laptop. The metadata proved she was an active, calculating architect of the cover-up. The judge accepted her cooperation against Thomas, granting a lighter sentence than her husband would receive, but completely denied her request for immunity. She was ordered to surrender her position at the charitable foundation, forfeit her heavily leveraged Westchester mansion, and serve a term in a state correctional facility. The absolute destruction of their family unit played out during Thomas's preliminary hearings. Father and son openly destroyed each other in the sterile courtroom. Thomas pointed an accusing finger at the defense table, loudly testifying that Brandon had assured him the patient was perfectly stable. My brother retaliated immediately, authorizing his attorney to project the damning email where our father explicitly forbade calling an ambulance to protect the donor event. I sat in the gallery, listening to them argue over who held the most liability. They did not speak about Lily as a human being, a daughter, or a sister. She was nothing more than a ruined asset, a mismanaged risk that had finally bankrupted them. Their true punishment was not just the impending prison sentences, but the agonizing reality that they could no longer trust anyone in their own bloodline. When the time finally came for my victim impact statement at the main sentencing hearing, I walked to the wooden podium and adjusted the microphone. I did not mention my surgical career, nor did I talk about the patients I had saved in Manhattan. I spoke only about a 26-year-old woman who loved silver ornaments and gardenia perfume. I told the silent courtroom about the last time Lily looked at me. I described how she had asked if a hospital was truly necessary, trusting her older sister to tell her the truth. Our family did not lose her to a single isolated surgical mistake, I explained, gripping the edges of the podium. She died because multiple people stood in a room and consciously chose their professional reputation over her survival, moment by moment, while there was still plenty of time to save her. The judge handed down the sentences before the lunch recess. Thomas received the longest state prison term because he had directed the cover-up, canceled the emergency response, manufactured evidence, coerced a witness, and attempted to destroy protected records. His medical license had already been revoked permanently. Brandon was remanded into custody under the terms of his plea agreement. He lost his medical license, his ownership interest in the clinic, and a substantial portion of his personal assets through restitution and the civil settlement. Evelyn received a shorter state prison sentence because she had eventually cooperated, but the court rejected her claim that she had acted only under duress. The remaining corporate assets were transferred under court supervision into separate funds designated for victim restitution and patient safety programs. A thick manila envelope arrived at my apartment 3 days after the sentencing. The return address belonged to the county detention center. Inside the rough paper lay a handwritten letter from Evelyn, begging me to visit the facility just once before she was transferred to the state penitentiary. She claimed she needed to offer a real apology, face to face. A small, tarnished brass key fell out of the folded stationery and clattered against my kitchen counter. My mother wrote that the key unlocked a cedar box in the estate's storage unit, the exact place she had carefully packed away Lily's silver snowflake. The following morning, I stood outside the visitation room of the county jail. Industrial bleach and stale sweat hung in the fluorescent hallway, a sharp contrast to the expensive perfume my mother had always worn. A corrections officer asked if I was ready to go inside. The small brass key rested in my palm, its jagged edge pressing into my skin. For 7 years, I had wanted Evelyn to look me in the eye and admit what she had done. Now that she was waiting on the other side of the reinforced glass, the craving was gone. I shook my head. I am not going in. Stepping back from the steel door, I called Rachel and asked her to deliver one final message. Evelyn had already spoken through her actions for 7 years. I did not need another carefully prepared performance designed to ease her own guilt. Refusing the visit was not revenge. It was the first boundary I had ever drawn without apologizing for it. Stepping back from the steel door, I pulled out my phone and dialed Rachel. My attorney answered on the first ring. I asked her to deliver a single, final message to the inmate waiting inside. Evelyn had already spoken to me through her actions for nearly a decade. I did not need to hear a carefully rehearsed performance designed only to ease her own guilt. Refusing the visit was not an act of petty vengeance. It was the first boundary I had ever successfully drawn to protect myself. The climate-controlled storage facility in Westchester smelled of dry cardboard and dust. Rows of metal roll-up doors stretched down a long concrete corridor, hiding the remnants of the seized Monroe estate. A legal clerk escorted me to the designated unit, unlocking the padlock before stepping away to give me privacy. My mother's brass key fit perfectly into the latch of a polished cedar box, sitting on top of a stack of moving crates. Opening the heavy wooden lid released the faint, lingering scent of gardenia. Inside rested a velvet pouch, a stack of old childhood photographs, and the heavy silver fountain pen Evelyn had placed next to the fabricated affidavit at the Christmas dinner. I bypassed the pen entirely. My fingers reached into the velvet pouch and pulled out the tarnished silver snowflake. The delicate ornament felt weightless in my hand. Running my thumb over the chipped metal edge brought a sudden, unexpected rush of peace. No hidden documents or secret confessions waited in the bottom of the box. The value held within the cedar walls was purely emotional. I slipped the snowflake into my coat pocket, leaving the silver pen resting in the dark. That expensive writing instrument belonged to the empire of coercion, and I had no intention of bringing it home. The public exoneration unfolded over the next several weeks. The state medical board officially updated their disciplinary records, formally declaring an absolute lack of evidence suggesting I had ever refused an emergency transfer. Local newspapers printed detailed retractions, finally clearing the cloud of suspicion that had suffocated my career. I kept my last name, refusing to change it out of shame, but I completely stopped allowing the Monroe legacy to define my professional worth. The substantial financial settlement seized from the clinic's frozen assets did not go into my personal bank account. Working alongside Rachel, we poured the liquidated funds into a newly established trust. The Lilly Patient Safety Initiative launched early that autumn. An independent board of directors managed the endowment, entirely removing any single family from controlling the capital. The program provided immediate legal protection and financial support for medical staff, blowing the whistle on private facility violations. Furthermore, the initiative funded emergency transport resources, guaranteeing that patients could be rapidly evacuated when private clinics deliberately delayed calling an ambulance. Governor Whitaker attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony in October. Standing at the outdoor podium, the politician kept his remarks remarkably brief. He told the gathered crowd that he had once witnessed a brilliant surgeon being treated as a total disgrace, but the undeniable truth ultimately required no political favors to survive. The governor stepped back, gracefully returning the stage to its rightful owner. Laura Whitaker took the microphone next. The governor's wife did not thank me as a wealthy donor or a political ally. She spoke directly to the audience as a vulnerable patient whose life depended on the exact medical integrity the initiative aimed to protect. Hearing her gratitude anchored the entire project in reality, completely separate from my family's toxic ambition. Winter arrived in Manhattan, blanketing the city in thick, white snow. 1 year had passed since the disastrous dinner in Westchester. My apartment smelled of roasting garlic and fresh rosemary, a sharp departure from the sterile catering of my childhood holidays. A small, sturdy oak table sat in the center of my dining room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Diane Mercer set a platter of roasted vegetables near the center, laughing at a joke Rachel was telling across the table. The former clinic nurse looked years younger, finally unburdened by the terrifying weight of my father's threats. Jordan Blake poured red wine into a cluster of glasses, handing one to a fellow trauma surgeon from my hospital department. No forced romantic tension existed between Jordan and me. We had simply forged a lasting friendship, becoming two people who safely guarded the memory of the woman we had both loved. I stepped away from the warm chatter and walked toward the small evergreen tree standing by the window. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the tarnished silver snowflake. I carefully draped the ribbon over a sturdy branch near the top. The streetlights outside caught the chipped edge of the metal, making the flaw sparkle brightly against the dark green needles. My father told me my place was in the dirt. He was wrong. My place was wherever I could sit without begging to be loved. If you have ever had to walk away from someone you loved to protect your own peace, share your story in the comments. You are not alone.